The cold iron bars pressed against Abigail Spencer's skin as she gripped them tightly, her knuckles turning white with desperation. "You cannot keep me here forever," she shouted at the retreating figure of her father, whose boots echoed against the wooden floor of their Colorado homestead. It was 1875, and at 20 years old, Abigail had just committed the unforgivable sin of refusing to marry Harold Winters, the wealthiest rancher in the county. "You'll stay in that cellar until you come to your senses, girl," her father called back, his voice cold and distant. "Winters is offering to save this family from ruin, and by God, you will accept his proposal." The door slammed shut, leaving Abigail in near darkness, save for the slim shafts of sunlight that crept through the tiny window near the ceiling. She sank to the earthen floor, her calico dress gathering dust as she wrapped her arms around her knees. The makeshift cell her father had constructed in their cellar had been intended for storing root vegetables, not imprisoning his daughter. But desperate times had driven Samuel Spencer to desperate measures. 3 days had passed since her confinement began. 3 days of refusing meals, of screaming until her voice grew hoarse, of promising herself she would never marry a man 30 years her senior with a reputation for cruelty toward his previous wives. On the 4th day, as dusk painted the sky beyond her small window, Abigail heard an unfamiliar sound, boots crunching on gravel outside the cellar's exterior entrance. She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding. No one used that entrance. It had been boarded up years ago when the new addition to the house was built. The scraping of wood against wood grew louder until suddenly, a sliver of fading daylight appeared. Someone was removing the boards. A shower of dirt fell from the ceiling as the unknown visitor worked. "Hello?" she called cautiously, pressing herself against the far wall. "Who's there?" The last board came free with a crack, and a man's silhouette filled the doorway. "Miss Spencer." The voice was low, with a slight drawl that marked him as not being from these parts. "Who are you?" she demanded, reaching for the only weapon at her disposal, a broken chair leg her father had overlooked when converting the cellar. The man descended the 3 steps slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. As he stepped into the dim light, Abigail could make out his features. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 25, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a clear mountain lake. His clothes were dusty from the trail, and a worn Stetson sat atop his head. "Name's Jackson Neill," he said quietly. "I worked for Harold Winters." Abigail raised the chair leg higher. "If you've come to drag me to him, I swear I'll—" "No, madame," he interrupted, still keeping his distance. "I've come to get you out." Her arm faltered slightly. "Why would you do that?" Jackson removed his hat, revealing a shock of dark hair that fell across his forehead. "Because no one deserves to be caged like an animal, especially not for refusing to marry a monster like Winters." Abigail lowered the chair leg slightly, suspicion warring with hope. "How do you know about this?" "About me? Town's been talking. Your father's been boasting to anyone who'll listen that you'll come around soon enough." Jackson's jaw tightened. "And I know Winters. Been working his ranch for 2 years. Seen how he treats women. When I heard what was happening, I couldn't stand by." A sound from upstairs made them both freeze. Footsteps crossed the floor above them. "We don't have much time," Jackson whispered urgently. "Your father's gone to town to finalize arrangements with Winters, but your brother's still here. Do you want to leave, Miss Spencer?" Abigail hesitated only for a moment. What waited for her if she stayed? A loveless marriage to a violent man, or continued imprisonment until she broke? She nodded firmly. "Yes." Jackson moved toward the iron-barred door and examined the lock. From his pocket, he produced a set of small tools that Abigail recognized as lockpicks. "Stand back," he murmured, inserting one of the slender instruments into the keyhole. "Where did you learn to do that?" she whispered, moving closer despite his warning. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Misspent youth. My pa was the sheriff in a small town in Texas. I used to practice on the jail cells when he wasn't looking. The lock clicked open after several tense moments. Jackson swung the door wide, and for the first time in days, Abigail stood on the other side of those bars. Freedom was so close she could taste it. "We need to move quickly," Jackson said, gesturing toward the cellar entrance he'd uncovered. "I have horses waiting in the trees beyond the western field." "I need to get some things," Abigail insisted. "I can't leave with nothing." Jackson looked uncertain but nodded. 5 minutes. "If your brother comes down those stairs, we run with or without your belongings." They crept up the interior cellar stairs together, pausing at the door to listen. The house was quiet, save for the distant sound of Abigail's brother, Thomas, chopping wood outside. "My room is upstairs, first door on the right," she whispered. Moving silently through the house that had been her prison, Abigail felt a strange detachment. This place had once been home, filled with memories of her mother before illness took her 2 years ago. Now it represented only confinement and betrayal. In her bedroom, she grabbed a carpet bag from beneath her bed and hastily filled it with essentials: a change of clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, a small pouch containing the few dollars she'd saved, and a worn photograph of her mother. As an afterthought, she took the small revolver her mother had kept hidden in her dresser drawer. Abigail had never fired it, but its weight was reassuring. When she returned to the hallway, Jackson was waiting tensely by the stairs. "Your brother's coming inside," he warned. They slipped down the back staircase just as the front door opened. Crossing the kitchen quickly, they escaped through the rear door and ran crouched along the edge of the house until they reached the corner. "The trees," Jackson pointed. "We need to make it across the field without being seen." They waited until Thomas disappeared into the barn, then ran. Abigail's heart hammered in her chest, her skirts clutched in one hand and her carpet bag in the other. She hadn't felt such exhilaration in years, the pure, heady rush of taking control of her own fate. 2 horses waited among the pines, Jackson's chestnut gelding and a smaller bay mare. "She's gentle," he assured Abigail as he helped her mount. "Can you ride astride?" Abigail nodded, hitching up her skirts shamelessly to settle into the saddle. Propriety seemed the least of her concerns now. As they rode away from the Spencer homestead, Abigail felt a curious mixture of terror and liberation. She had no idea where they were going or what would happen next, but for the first time in years, the decision was hers to make. "Where are we headed?" she asked as they put distance between themselves and her father's property. "I have a friend with a cabin about 20 miles west of here," Jackson replied. "We can shelter there tonight, figure out a longer plan. Winters has men all over the county. They'll be looking for you for us by morning. Why risk yourself this way for a stranger?" Abigail pressed. It was the question that had been burning in her mind since he appeared at the cellar door. Jackson was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "My sister," he finally said, his voice tight. "She was forced to marry a man like Winters 3 years ago. By the time I found her, it was too late." He didn't elaborate further, but he didn't need to. The pain in his voice told Abigail everything. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Don't be sorry. Just be free." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "That's all the thanks I need." They rode in companionable silence as the sun sank lower in the sky. Abigail found herself studying her rescuer's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon for trouble. There was a steadiness to him that she found comforting in the midst of such uncertainty. As darkness fell, they reached a small clearing where a modest cabin stood. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a lantern glowed in the window. "That's odd," Jackson murmured. reining his horse to a stop. Tom wasn't supposed to be here until next week. Is it safe? Abigail asked, suddenly tense. Wait here. Jackson dismounted and approached the cabin cautiously, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Before he reached the door, it swung open, revealing a tall man with a rifle. That you, Jack? The man called. It's me, Tom, Jackson replied, visibly relaxing. Got company with me. Tom lowered his rifle. Heard there might be trouble. Winter's men were in town yesterday, boasting about a wedding. Figured you might do something foolish. Jackson gestured for Abigail to approach. As she dismounted, Tom gave her an appraising look before offering a curt nod. Miss Spencer, I presume. Tom Blackwood. This here's my hunting cabin, and you're welcome to it. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood, Abigail replied, summoning what dignity she could muster despite her dusty clothes and tangled hair. The cabin was small but clean, with a main room containing a table, chairs, and a stone fireplace, plus a tiny bedroom off to one side. Tom had a pot of stew bubbling over the fire, and the smell made Abigail realize how little she'd eaten in the past days. As they sat down to eat, Tom filled them in on the town gossip. Winters is in a fury. Seems one of his men went missing. He glanced meaningfully at Jackson. Right around the same time you did, and now with his bride to be gone, he's offering a hefty reward for information. Jackson's expression remained neutral. How hefty? $500 for the girl, $300 for you. Tom spooned more stew into his bowl. Dead or alive, for you at least. Abigail gasped. This is my fault. I've put you in danger. No, Jackson said firmly. I made my choice. Winters and I had unfinished business anyway. Tom glanced between them. You two need a plan. Can't hide out here forever. I have family in California, Abigail offered. My mother's sister. She wrote after Mother died, offering me a home, but Father refused to let me go. Jackson nodded slowly. California's a long way. We'd need supplies, money. I have a little saved, Abigail said, touching the pouch in her pocket. And I know where Winters keeps his cash, Jackson added, a determined glint in his eye. Tom let out a low whistle. You're thinking of robbing Winters? That's suicide, Jack. Not robbery, Jackson corrected. I earned that money. 3 months' wages he never paid me. Plus, he owes me for my sister. The conversation continued late into the night, plans being made and discarded as they considered their options. Eventually, Tom insisted Abigail take the bedroom while he and Jackson would sleep by the fire. Lying on the narrow cot, exhaustion finally catching up to her, Abigail found herself thinking about Jackson Neill. He'd risked everything for her, a woman he didn't even know, because of a principle, because of a painful memory. In a world where men like her father and Harold Winters saw women as property to be traded and controlled, Jackson stood apart. For the first time in days, Abigail fell asleep without tears, a fragile hope taking root in her heart. Morning came with a sense of urgency. Tom had ridden out before dawn to scout the area and returned with troubling news. Winters has men combing every road and trail within 30 miles, he reported, accepting the cup of coffee Abigail handed him. They're offering locals cash to report any strangers passing through. Jackson paced the small cabin, brow furrowed in thought. We need to change our appearance. Take the back trails. What about a different plan entirely? Abigail suggested. Both men turned to look at her. What if we didn't run? What if we dealt with Winters directly? Meaning what, exactly? Jackson asked, his expression cautious. Meaning I confront him. In public. Make it known what he's done, what my father's done. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. If everyone knows he tried to force a woman into marriage, his reputation would suffer. Tom shook his head. Begging your pardon, Miss Spencer, but that's naive. Winters owns half the county. People won't cross him. They might, Jackson said slowly, if they had proof of his other dealings, the cattle rustling, the land grabs, the men who've disappeared after crossing him. You have proof? Tom asked, surprised. Jackson nodded grimly. I kept a journal. Dates, names, overheard conversations. Is hidden at the ranch. I always figured someday I might need leverage. That's something, at least, Tom conceded. But you'd never get near enough to Winters to use it. He'll shoot you on sight. Not if I'm bringing him what he wants most. Jackson looked at Abigail, and she understood immediately. No, she said firmly. I won't be bait. Not bait, Jackson corrected. A distraction. If Winters thinks he's getting what he wants, he'll let his guard down. I can get to my journal, and we can take it straight to the federal marshal in Carson City. It's too dangerous, Abigail insisted. Everything's dangerous right now, Jackson countered. At least this way we fight back instead of just running. The debate continued through breakfast, but eventually, a plan began to take shape. Tom would spread word in town that he'd seen Abigail traveling alone, headed east away from Winters' ranch. Meanwhile, Jackson would secretly return to the ranch to retrieve his journal, and Abigail would remain hidden at the cabin. 3 days, Jackson promised as he prepared to leave. Give me 3 days. If I'm not back, Tom will get you to Carson City, and you can take the stage to California from there. Abigail stood in the doorway, worry etched on her face. In just 24 hours, this man had become important to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Be careful, she said softly. Jackson paused, then reached out to touch her cheek lightly. I promised you freedom, Abigail Spencer. I aim to keep that promise. After he rode away, Abigail turned to find Tom watching her with a knowing expression. Known Jack long? He asked casually. Since yesterday, she admitted. Tom chuckled. Figures. He always did fall hard and fast. At her questioning look, he added, I've known that boy since he was 17. Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Abigail felt her cheeks warm. He's just being kind. Jack's kind to lots of folks. This is different. Tom picked up his rifle. I'm going to set some snares. Make yourself at home, Miss Spencer. Left alone, Abigail busied herself with chores around the cabin, grateful for the distraction. As she worked, she found herself wondering about Jackson's life, his past. What had driven him to work for a man like Winters? What dreams had he harbored before tragedy struck his family? The day passed slowly, tension building with each hour. When Tom returned with 2 rabbits for their supper, Abigail was grateful for something to do, skinning and preparing the meat as her mother had taught her. You're handy in a crisis, Tom observed as they ate. Most ladies of your standing would be having vapors by now. Abigail smiled wryly. My standing isn't what it once was. After Mother died, Father's drinking got worse. The farm suffered. I've had to be practical. Jack could use practical, Tom said casually. Boy's got heart but not always sense. You care for him, Abigail observed, like the brother I never had. Tom's expression grew serious. Which is why I'm telling you now, if you're not serious about him, don't lead him on. He's had enough heartbreak. I barely know him, Abigail protested. Sometimes that doesn't matter, Tom replied, his eyes distant. Sometimes you just know. That night, Abigail lay awake thinking about Tom's words, about Jackson's touch on her cheek, about the strange, swift connection she felt to this man who had risked everything to save her from a cage. The second day passed in anxious waiting. Tom went into town for supplies and returned with newspapers and gossip. Harold Winters had doubled the reward for information on Jackson's whereabouts. Abigail's father was claiming she'd been kidnapped. "It's working, though," Tom reported. "Winters has men searching every trail heading east. The ranch itself is less guarded than usual." That night, a storm blew in from the mountains, rattling the cabin's windows and sending rain lashing against the roof. Abigail found herself standing by the window, peering into the darkness, imagining Jackson out there somewhere, perhaps caught in the deluge. "He knows these mountains better than most," Tom reassured her, noticing her vigil. "If anyone can make it through, it's Jack." On the morning of the third day, Tom needed to check his trap lines. "Will you be all right alone for a few hours?" he asked Abigail. She nodded, though anxiety knotted her stomach. "I have the revolver you showed me how to use. I'll be fine." After Tom left, Abigail tried to occupy herself with mending, but her mind kept wandering. As noon approached, she heard hoofbeats approaching and grabbed the revolver, her heart racing. Peering through the window, she saw a rider approaching slowly, hunched over in the saddle. Even at a distance, she recognized Jackson's chestnut gelding, but something was wrong. The horse's gait was uneven, and the rider swayed precariously. Forgetting caution, Abigail rushed outside. As she reached the clearing, Jackson's horse stopped, and its rider slid from the saddle, collapsing to the ground. "Jackson!" Abigail cried, running to his side. His clothes were torn and muddied, and blood stained his left sleeve. His face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut. "Got it," he mumbled as she knelt beside him. From inside his coat, he pulled a small leather-bound book. "Got the journal." "Never mind that now," she said urgently, helping him to his feet. "Let's get you inside." Supporting his weight as best she could, Abigail guided him into the cabin and helped him onto the cot in the bedroom. His skin burned with fever as she removed his coat and shirt to assess his injuries. A bullet had grazed his upper arm, leaving an angry wound that had begun to fester. His torso was mottled with bruises, and a deep cut ran along his hairline. Working quickly, Abigail heated water and gathered the medical supplies Tom kept in a small chest. She cleaned Jackson's wounds carefully, her touch gentle despite her growing concern. "What happened?" she asked as she bandaged his arm. Jackson's good eye opened, focusing on her face. "Ambush," he said hoarsely. "One of the ranch hands recognized me. Got away, but not before they left their mark." "You should have left the journal," she scolded softly. "It wasn't worth your life." "It is if it keeps you safe," he replied, his hand finding hers. "Worth every bruise." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of feelings that had been building since that first meeting in her father's cellar. Without thinking, Abigail leaned down and pressed her lips gently to his forehead. "Rest now," she whispered. "You're safe." Jackson's eyes closed, his breathing evening out as exhaustion claimed him. Abigail sat beside him, holding his hand, watching the rise and fall of his chest with each breath. When Tom returned hours later, he found her still at Jackson's bedside, applying cool cloths to his fevered brow. After examining Jackson's wounds himself, Tom's expression was grave. "That arm needs a doctor," he said quietly. "Infection's setting in." "Can you fetch one?" Abigail asked. Tom shook his head. "Nearest doctor's in town." Taking him there would be delivering him straight to Winters. "Then I'll go," Abigail decided, rising to her feet. "I'll go to town and bring back medicine." "That's too dangerous," Tom protested. "You'd be recognized immediately." "Not if I'm careful." Abigail's mind was already working through the possibilities. "I can wear your spare clothes, bind my hair. It's nearly dark, no one will look closely at another young man riding through town." Tom looked skeptical but eventually nodded. The apothecary, then, not the doctor. Less chance of being recognized. Ask for Mr. Peterson and tell him Tom sent you for fever powder and tincture of iodine. Disguised in Tom's 2 large clothes, her hair tucked beneath a worn hat, Abigail rode toward town on Tom's mule. Fear churned in her stomach, but determination drove her forward. Jackson had risked everything for her freedom. Now she would risk herself for his life. The small town of Eagles Bend was quiet as she approached, just a few souls still moving about in the gathering dusk. Keeping her head down, Abigail made her way to the apothecary on the main street. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. An elderly man looked up from behind the counter. "Help you, young man?" Deepening her voice as best she could, Abigail replied, "Tom sent me for fever powder and tincture of iodine, Mr. Peterson." The pharmacist studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Tom Blackwood? Haven't seen him in town lately. Been busy with his trap lines," Abigail replied, hoping her nervousness wasn't obvious. As Mr. Peterson gathered the requested items, the bell jingled again. Abigail kept her back to the door, heart pounding. "Evening, Sheriff," Peterson called. "What brings you by?" "Just checking in," a deep voice replied. "Any strangers come through today?" Abigail froze, not daring to turn around. Under the counter, her hands trembled. "Just the usual travelers," Peterson replied, wrapping Abigail's purchases in brown paper. "And young Tom's assistant here." The sheriff's boots sounded on the wooden floor as he approached. Abigail could feel his presence behind her, too close for comfort. "Don't believe we've met, boy," the sheriff said. "You new to Tom's outfit?" Keeping her head down, Abigail nodded, mumbling, "Just passing through, helping out for a spell." There was a tense pause before the sheriff said, "Well, tell Tom that Harold Winters is looking for him. Wants to ask about some missing property." "I'll tell him," Abigail replied, her voice barely above a whisper. After what felt like an eternity, the sheriff moved away, exchanging a few more words with Peterson before leaving the shop. Abigail paid quickly and hurried outside, keeping her face averted from the few people on the street. She was nearly to the edge of town when a voice called out, "Hold up there, boy!" Panic surged through her as she recognized her father's voice. Without looking back, she kicked the mule into a trot, then a canter, heading for the trail that led back to the cabin. Hoofbeats sounded behind her. Her father was following. The mule, not built for speed, began to labor beneath her. Abigail knew she couldn't outrun a horse. Desperate, she veered off the main trail into the trees, hoping to lose her pursuer in the gathering darkness. Branches whipped at her face as she urged the mule forward, deeper into the forest. The sounds of pursuit grew distant, then faded entirely. Had she lost him, or was it a trick? After riding for what felt like hours, taking a circuitous route back to Tom's cabin, Abigail finally arrived, exhausted and shaking. Tom met her at the door, rifle in hand. "What happened?" he demanded, seeing her state. "The sheriff was there," she gasped, handing him the medicine. "And my father saw me leaving town. I think I lost him, but I can't be sure." Tom's expression hardened. "We need to move, if they trace you back here." Inside, Jackson was awake, propped up against the wall, his face pale but alert. "I heard," he said as they entered. "Abigail, you shouldn't have risked yourself. As if you're one to talk about unnecessary risks," she retorted, kneeling beside him to check his bandages. While Tom prepared the medicine, Abigail brought Jackson up to date on what had happened in town. His fever had broken, but he was still weak from blood loss and the ordeal of his journey back to the cabin. "The journal," he said suddenly, reaching for the leather book. "We need to get this to the federal marshal in Carson City. It's our only leverage against Winters." You're in no condition to travel, Abigail insisted. We don't have a choice, Tom interjected, looking out the window. I can see torches on the north ridge. Someone's coming, and it ain't friendly. Urgency propelled them into action. Tom gathered essential supplies while Abigail helped Jackson dress. Despite his protests, she insisted on supporting him as they made their way to the horses. There's a line shack about 15 miles south, Tom told them as he helped Jackson mount. Follow the creek, then cut east at the lightning-struck pine. You can shelter there tonight. I'll meet you after I lead these fellows on a wild goose chase. Tom Jackson began, but the older man cut him off. Don't argue, Jack. You saved my life once. Consider this partial repayment. He handed Jackson a rifle. Now go, and take care of that girl. She's got more spine than most men I know. With torches visible on the approaching hillside, Abigail and Jackson rode south, keeping to the shadows. Jackson was unsteady in the saddle, but determination kept him upright. Abigail rode close beside him, ready to offer support if he faltered. The night was clear, stars providing just enough light to navigate by. They followed the creek as Tom had instructed, moving as quickly as they dared. Occasionally, they heard distant shouts behind them, but the sounds grew fainter as they put distance between themselves and their pursuers. When they reached the lightning-struck pine, they turned east, traveling through increasingly rugged terrain. Jackson's strength was flagging, but he refused to stop until they reached safety. The line shack appeared just as dawn was breaking, a small, rough structure built for cowboys working the distant ranges. Inside, they found a cot, a small stove, and basic provisions. Abigail helped Jackson to the cot, then set about lighting the stove and preparing a simple meal from the supplies they'd brought and those stored in the shack. We made it, she said, bringing him a cup of hot coffee laced with the fever powder. Jackson nodded wearily. For now. But Winters won't stop looking. Not until he gets what he wants. Then we'll have to make sure he doesn't, Abigail replied with determination. Once we get your journal to the marshal. It's not just about the journal anymore, Abigail. Jackson's blue eyes met hers. It's about you. Winters considers you his property now. Men like him don't let go easily. She sat beside him on the edge of the cot. I'm not afraid. You should be, he said softly. But your courage is one of the things I admire most about you. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. In just a few days, you've become more important to me than I can say. Abigail's heart quickened. Jackson, I know it's too soon, he continued, his voice low. We barely know each other. But sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of time. Sometimes you just know. The echo of Tom's words made Abigail smile. That's what Tom said about you, that you fall hard and fast. A rueful smile crossed Jackson's bruised face. Did he now? Meddling old man. Was he wrong? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson's hand reached up to touch her cheek, much as he had done before leaving for the ranch. No, he said simply. He wasn't wrong. In that moment, Abigail knew her own heart as well. This man who had broken her cage, who had offered her freedom without demands, who had risked his life to protect her, he had claimed a place in her heart that no one had ever touched before. Slowly, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, mindful of his injuries, but filled with promise. When they parted, Jackson's eyes held a light that transcended his pain. I never expected to find you, he murmured. Nor I you, she replied. But now that I have, I don't intend to let go. They spent the day recovering, planning their next move. Carson City was still 2 days' ride away, assuming Jackson's strength held. They would need to avoid main roads and towns where Winter's influence might reach. As evening fell, they heard a horse approaching. Jackson positioned himself by the window with the rifle while Abigail stood ready by the door with her revolver. Relief washed over them both when Tom's familiar figure appeared in the clearing. He looked tired but unharmed as he dismounted and approached the shack. "Led them all the way to the territorial border," he announced as he entered. "Lost them in the canyons. They think you're headed for Utah. Any sign of pursuit in this direction?" Jackson asked. Tom shook his head. "Not yet, but Winters has telegraphed descriptions to every town within 100 miles. Your faces are becoming famous." Over a meager supper, they laid out their plan. Tom would accompany them to Carson City, providing an extra gun and knowledge of trails few others used. Once there, they would take the journal directly to Marshal Daniels, known for his incorruptibility. "And after?" Tom asked, looking between them. "Assuming the marshal acts on your evidence, what then?" Jackson glanced at Abigail before answering. "California still seems like a good idea. Fresh start. Together?" Tom asked bluntly. A moment of silence hung in the air before Abigail spoke. "Yes," she said firmly. "Together." The journey to Carson City was grueling. They traveled by night when possible, resting during daylight hours in hidden locations. Jackson's strength gradually returned, aided by Abigail's care and his own stubborn determination. On the second night, camped in a sheltered ravine, Jackson pulled something from his saddlebag and approached Abigail as she sat by the small fire. "I've been carrying this since we left Tom's cabin," he said, sitting beside her. From his pocket, he produced a small silver ring with a single blue stone. "It was my mother's. My father gave it to her when they had nothing but dreams and each other." Abigail's breath caught as he took her hand. "I know this isn't the life you imagined," he continued, "running from danger, facing an uncertain future. But if you're willing to take a chance on me, on us, I promise to spend every day trying to make you happy." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Jackson's smile was tender. "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Abigail Spencer. Not because anyone's forcing you, but because you choose to. Because somehow, in the middle of all this chaos, we found each other." Tom, pretending to be occupied with his coffee on the other side of the fire, failed to hide his grin. "Yes," Abigail whispered, her heart full. "Yes, I will marry you, Jackson Neill." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt nothing like the cold obligation her father had tried to force upon her. This was a choice freely made, a promise exchanged between equals. They reached Carson City the following evening, a bustling town that offered both opportunity and anonymity. The federal marshal's office was closed for the night, so they took rooms at a small hotel on the outskirts of town, planning to present their case first thing in the morning. Morning brought clarity and purpose. Jackson's journal, combined with Abigail's testimony about her father's actions and Winter's reputation, provided Marshal Daniels with enough evidence to launch a full investigation. "This won't be resolved overnight," the marshal warned them after taking their statements. "Men like Winters have powerful friends. But I give you my word, I'll see justice done." "And my father?" Abigail asked hesitantly. The marshal's expression softened slightly. "Holding someone against their will is a crime, Miss Spencer, regardless of relation. But cooperating with our investigation might help his case." As they left the marshal's office, a weight seemed to lift from Jackson's shoulders. "It's done," he said quietly. "Whatever happens now, Winters can't hide from his crimes anymore." They were married that afternoon in a small church on Pine Street, with Tom standing as witness. The ceremony was simple, the words profound. As they exchanged vows, Abigail thought of the cage her father had built and the man who had broken its lock, offering her not just freedom but a love she'd never dared to imagine. 3 months later, A letter arrived at their small ranch outside Sacramento, where they'd settled with Tom as their neighbor and partner. The marshal's investigation had resulted in multiple indictments against Harold Winters, including cattle rustling, land fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Samuel Spencer had cooperated fully, his testimony crucial to the case, and had received a reduced sentence for his role in Abigail's imprisonment. "Your father included a personal note," Jackson said, handing Abigail a folded paper. The note was brief but sincere, an apology for his actions, a request for forgiveness, a hope that she had found happiness. Abigail read it twice before folding it carefully and placing it in her pocket. "Will you write back?" Jackson asked, watching her thoughtfully. Abigail considered the question as she looked out over their land, the vegetable garden she'd planted, the small herd of cattle they were building, the foundation for the house they would raise children in someday. "Yes," she decided, "not for his sake but for mine, to close that chapter completely." Jackson drew her into his arms, his hand resting protectively over her stomach, where their first child had just begun to grow. "You never cease to amaze me, Abigail Neill." She smiled up at him, this man who had given her both freedom and love. "We have a lifetime for me to keep surprising you." As the California sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Abigail thought of the iron bars that had once imprisoned her and the journey that had led her here to open skies, to endless possibilities, to a love that had been worth every risk. The cage was broken, its memory fading, and in its place stood a future as boundless as the western horizon, built on a foundation of choice, courage, and a love that had begun with the simple act of unlocking a door.